In April 1983, more than 100,000 people lined the streets of Brisbane. But when Prince Charles moved down his side of the avenue, some in the crowd were disappointed. They were not waiting for the future king. They were waiting for Diana. Charles was there as the heir to the throne, the man meant to embody the crown. Yet along the barricades, attention kept sliding away from him. Then Charles turned the awkwardness into a public joke. He said it would have been far easier to have had two wives to cover both sides of the street, while he stood in the middle directing the operation. The room laughed, but the joke left a trace. It showed the future king publicly noticing that the stage was shifting toward his young wife. So why would one joke in Brisbane become a palace problem? A joke is not a confession. A crowd reaction is not a marriage history. But it is a starting point. A reported public event where the expected order of attention visibly shifted. So the question is not simply whether Charles felt jealous. Later sources speak to that, including Diana's own words and Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography of Charles. But jealousy alone is too small for what happened next. The evidence has three layers. First, the confirmed record: tour reports, speeches, photographs, and public appearances. Second, the reported record: biographies, interviews, and accounts from people around the royal household, each with limits. Third, the interpretation: what those facts suggest about power inside an institution built on rank. So when we use the word secret here, it does not mean a criminal plot or a hidden order to destroy Diana. It means narrative management. Which stories were encouraged, which images were emphasized, and which royal role the palace needed the public to take seriously. Inside monarchy, attention is not just attention. It signals authority. And in 1983, the arrows of attention began pointing in the wrong direction. That is why Charles's position mattered before Diana became a global figure. He was the Prince of Wales, the designated heir, trained from childhood to carry the monarchy forward in public. In that system, visibility was not vanity, it was preparation. Every school visit, factory tour, charity speech, and handshake built the image of a future king. Useful, serious, ready. Royal tours made that image visible at scale. They were staged acts of diplomacy, routes approved, hosts briefed, speeches drafted, press positions arranged, motorcades timed, crowds behind barriers, and local newspapers waiting for the defining image. The tour had a script. The royal guest arrived. Officials received him. Cameras recorded the exchange. The crowd supplied warmth, but hierarchy supplied meaning. If the heir visited Australia, Canada, New Zealand, or another part of the Commonwealth world, the display reinforced one idea. This person mattered because the institution mattered, and one day he would embody it. That is why attention inside the monarchy functions almost like currency. A front-page photograph can make a royal roll feel alive. A bored crowd can make it feel ornamental. A speech ignored by the press weakens the argument that the heir has a public purpose beyond waiting. Before Diana, the palace understood how to manage that older reverence. The press pool could be guided toward the salute, the bouquet, the inspection line, the worthy speech. Charles's causes, architecture, the environment, youth opportunity, the prince's trust, fit that model. They needed time, context, and a public willing to listen. Then Diana entered the same machinery with a different force. She did not have to explain a policy interest to become news. A glance, a dress, a shy smile at the edge of a rope line could move the cameras by itself. At first, that was a gift to the monarchy. Soon, it became a problem of direction. Diana's arrival did not look like a threat at first. It looked like rescue. In 1981, the monarchy was handed an image it could hardly have designed better. A young nursery assistant, engaged to the Prince of Wales, shy in front of microphones, instantly readable on camera and surrounded by fairy tale language. Buckingham Palace knew how to use. The wedding turned that image into a global event, monarchy as ceremony and monarchy as television. The dress, the carriage, the balcony, the kiss replayed as popular culture. For millions watching, Diana made an ancient institution feel close enough to care about. That closeness mattered. She bent down to children. She looked nervous without seeming remote. Her clothes became headlines because they gave the press a story before anyone had spoken. For the palace, it was useful. Diana brought youth, warmth, and emotional immediacy to a family often accused of stiffness. But usefulness inside a hierarchy has limits. As cameras learned to find Diana first, royal attention stopped following rank. A visit once measured by the heir's speech or handshake could now be dominated by what Diana wore, where she stood, who she smiled at, and whether the crowd had seen her. By the time the Prince and Princess of Wales set out for Australia and New Zealand in 1983, Diana was no longer just helping Charles carry the monarchy's image. Increasingly, the image was carrying her past him. Australia and New Zealand became the public test. Officially, this was a Commonwealth tour. Ceremonies, receptions, speeches, handshakes, motorcades, the familiar machinery of Commonwealth diplomacy. Charles was the Prince of Wales, the future king, and the schedule still treated him as the senior figure. But the crowds did not always behave as protocol expected. Archival reporting described enormous turnouts, especially in Australia, where some crowds were reported in the hundreds of thousands. People waited for hours behind barriers, not simply to see the royal couple, but to catch Diana in particular. The young princess in bright dresses, holding flowers, leaning toward children, giving photographers the image they had come to capture. That difference mattered because royal walkabouts split attention physically. Charles could take one side of a street while Diana took the other. In theory, that doubled the reach of the visit. In practice, it exposed the imbalance. Reports from the time described people showing visible disappointment when Charles came down their side instead of Diana. Not everywhere, not every person, not a measurement of national feeling, but enough to be noticed, printed, and remembered. For a monarchy built on rank, that was awkward evidence. The heir was present, the cameras were present, the crowd was present. Still, the emotional center kept moving away from him. Then came the line that made the imbalance visible. At a public engagement in April 1983, Charles turned the situation into a joke. He said he had concluded it would have been far easier to have had two wives, so both sides of the street could be covered. Then, he added, he should have been in the middle, directing the operation. The line drew laughter because it was polished enough for the room, but it also named the problem. Diana was not just popular beside him. Her popularity had become a logistical fact, something the tour itself had to organize around. That is why Brisbane matters. The quote is not a secret recording or a window into every private feeling. It is public evidence that the imbalance was visible at the time, visible enough for Charles to acknowledge it in front of an audience. By the end of the tour, the palace had received the message the crowds were sending. The young Princess of Wales could electrify a royal visit in a way that helped the monarchy enormously. But the same attention also made the future king look, at moments, like the secondary figure in his own constitutional story. The next question is what that public imbalance did behind palace gates. For that, the evidence shifts from crowds and headlines to later sources: Diana's own account, Charles's authorized biography, and biographers who tried to reconstruct the pressure between them. Behind palace gates, the strongest evidence does not come from one diary page or one dramatic confession. It comes from sources that differ in tone but circle the same pressure point. In 1995, in her BBC Panorama interview, Diana gave the most direct public version of it. Speaking about the attention that followed her, she said, With the media attention came a lot of jealousy. A lot of complicated situations arose because of that. That is Diana's account, delivered years later, during a collapsing marriage and a public battle over narrative. It is not a camera inside Charles's mind, but it is a direct statement from one of the two people at the center of the imbalance. Charles's side appears differently in Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography, published in 1994. There, the frustration is not framed as wanting applause. It is tied to work. Charles had spent years trying to be taken seriously on architecture, agriculture, education, the environment, and the prince's trust. But the press often found the easier story in Diana's dress, Diana's smile, Diana's glance toward a crowd. That distinction matters. A private wound and an institutional problem overlapped. If the future king's serious causes were being eclipsed by his wife's image, then the issue was also about public authority. Andrew Morton and later biographers, including writers with different sympathies, describe the imbalance as a recurring source of strain. They do not agree on every motive, conversation, or degree of blame, but the pattern is hard to miss. Diana's fame created extraordinary value for the monarchy, while also making Charles appear less central than his rank required. So the ledger does not prove a secret order or a simple villain. It shows public asymmetry, documented frustration, and a palace incentive to correct the picture. This is where the palace incentive becomes visible. Once Diana's popularity began to make Charles look secondary, the problem moved beyond hurt feelings and into the machinery of monarchy itself. No one needed to write a dramatic order saying, "Reduce Diana." The system already knew what it was built to protect. The heir had to look substantial, prepared, and like a future king whose ideas mattered, not a man being politely tolerated while the crowd waited for his wife. So the response became rebalancing. Push Charles's speeches. Emphasize the architecture lectures, the environmental warnings, the work with young people through the prince's trust. Present him as serious, intellectual, charitable, and ahead of his time. If Diana was being read as glamour and warmth, Charles had to be read as duty and substance. That distinction management matters because narrative management does not have to look like a conspiracy. In a press office, it can look ordinary. Which engagement gets highlighted? Which quote is handed to reporters? Which cause is framed as visionary? Which photograph is encouraged? Which headline is quietly welcomed because it restores the proper order of importance? By the late 1980s and early 1990s, as several accounts describe, that managed imbalance hardened into rival narratives. One track presented Charles as the serious, misunderstood heir whose work had been overshadowed. The other kept returning to Diana as the emotional center of the royal story, the person cameras followed and readers felt they knew. The palace had tried to correct the attention arrows, but once public affection had attached itself to Diana, it could not simply be redirected by protocol. That is where the strategy began to backfire. Diana did not vanish from the media system. She learned how powerful it was. As the system tried to put Diana back into a manageable frame, her own version of events became more valuable. By 1992, the story was no longer confined to balcony appearances, tour photographs, or carefully worded palace statements. Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story, brought private anguish into the public record in a way the monarchy had not faced before. Accounts differ on the exact mechanics behind the book, so the responsible point is narrower. Diana's story could reach the public without passing through the palace gate. That changed the media balance. If Charles had an authorized biography with Jonathan Dimbleby in 1994 to explain his life, work, and frustrations, Diana had become something just as potent in the media age. Not only a subject of coverage, but a source of narrative authority. Then, in 1995, the camera turned directly to Diana. Sitting under studio lights, speaking directly to millions, Diana did what the palace system was built to prevent. She bypassed the filters. She described the marriage, the pressure, and the effect of the media attention in her own words, including her claim that the attention had brought a lot of jealousy and a lot of complicated situations. For the monarchy, this was more than an embarrassing interview. It was evidence that the old command structure around royal image had cracked. The battle that began with crowds turning toward Diana had become a public contest over credibility. Whose pain counted, whose duty mattered, and who had the right to define the truth. The cost was severe. A royal marriage became a national spectacle. Palace briefings and personal testimony fed each other. Public affection, once treated as an asset, became a force the institution could not fully contain. By the time the story reaches the closed palace gates, the question is no longer whether Diana was popular. The question is what the evidence allows us to say about what that popularity exposed. At those gates, the evidence narrows to 4 points we can say with confidence. First, there was a public imbalance. On the 1983 tour, cameras, crowds, and headlines repeatedly pulled toward Diana in ways that made the future king look secondary. Second, there was documented frustration. Diana later described jealousy around the media attention, and Dimbleby's authorized biography recorded Charles's anger that his work was being eclipsed. Third, there was narrative management. The palace had every institutional reason to recenter the heir as serious, useful, and indispensable. Fourth, there was backfire. The more Diana was treated as a problem of image control, the more powerful her own public voice became. That is the responsible shape of this secret. Not a single hidden order, not a criminal plot, a system. The monarchy depended on the idea that rank could organize attention. Diana exposed the weakness in that idea. Affection did not follow protocol. Crowds did not look where protocol told them to look. Newspapers did not always protect the hierarchy they profited from photographing. Charles's resentment, then, was never only a private emotion. It belonged to a larger crisis inside an institution built to make the heir appear inevitable. Diana's fame made him look optional. After that, the palace could manage the story, brief around it, and try to rebalance the light. But it could not make the old rule true again. Rank does not guarantee affection. For more royal history told through power, betrayal, and consequence, stay with Palace Scandals.